Hi, I'm Bruce Starr. I'm running for the Oregon Senate. Well, I've got a record of accomplishment in my time in the legislature. As this campaign seems to be, everybody's talking about jobs. That's the one thing that I have done in my time in Salem is help to create hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of private sector jobs happening right now on Highway 26. If you drove out here to Hillsborough, I'm sure you saw the construction that was going on there. Those are private sector jobs that have been created because of the work that I've done in Salem, specifically on transportation policy. Clearly there's jobs here in Washington County, but there's jobs also throughout the entire state. And as the campaign seems to be about who's creating jobs, I would point to my record of private sector job creation, getting dollars out into the community where we have hundreds of men and women that are working across the state, as opposed to creating thousands of public sector jobs that seems to have happened under the current political majority in Salem. Those are things that are important. In addition to that, I think you have to look at a record of accomplishment as it relates to crime issues, protecting our communities. When the Connell House was located in Cornelius, and very violent offenders were located there, and the local sheriff, Sheriff Gordon, kind of made everybody aware of that. It's important that the legislature react and respond, and I did that by introducing and passing legislation that requires the state to communicate with local law enforcement before they locate violent offenders back in our communities. That's something that's happening all across the state, not just here in Washington County. But I stood up, I recognized that we needed to change the problem, and I got legislation passed to do just that. Fighting for fiscal responsibility, fighting against irresponsible spending, those are issues that I think are important in our state as we look forward. We cannot continue to do business as usual in Salem. It's our state is in I think a significant trouble as it relates to fiscal discipline. We haven't had any in Salem for the last several years. Continue to grow the state budget by billions of dollars. At the same time, we cut critical services like education. K-12 education was cut by several $100 million, while the rest of the state budget grew. Those kinds of things are wrong, and we ought to address them. We have to get our fiscal house in order. Part of that, what we need to do is create what I would call a real reserve, or a real rainy day fund. We need to force the legislature and the governor to exhibit some fiscal discipline. And by that I mean the legislature ought to not spend all of the money that Oregon taxpayers generously send to Salem. We should spend perhaps 97% of the money that comes and save 3%. I've had legislation introduced in the last couple of years, last couple of sessions in Salem that did just this. But the Democrat majority wasn't very excited about moving the bill forward. I think we need to do that. We need to focus on that. I'm glad that our candidate for governor, Chris Dudley, has championed this idea. I think it's an important one. If we would just spend 97% of the money that comes in and save 3%, that 3% would grow significantly over time. And when we come into the next recession, instead of having to go to voters and raise taxes like the Democrats did in this last couple of years, we could dip into a reserve, a healthy reserve, and balance out the reality of having to provide important services to Oregonians. That's something that we have to do. It's something that I'm passionate about. It's an issue that will, over the long run in the state of Oregon, provide a fiscal solid foundation that we need, that we haven't had. The bottom line is that we have to change the way we do business in Salem, and I think we have to look at programs that are no longer effective or efficient and reduce those. If you look at the growth of state government over the last 4 years, it has grown by about 49%. That's almost half, again, bigger than it was 4 years prior. That's huge. It's unbelievable. In the middle of a recession, the majorities in Salem have continued to pile on more programs, more public debt, more spending. And I think we need to look at the programs that have been instituted over the last 4 years first, to reduce and roll those back, because Oregon survived without them until the last 4 years. We need to look at consolidating state agencies. Are there certain agencies that we can blend together to save some administrative costs? I think that's something that we need to look at very carefully. There's also a state agency that is it's called the Department of Administrative Services. It's kind of a buffer between the governor's office and all of the rest of the state agencies. I think we need to look carefully at that particular state agency. It has grown. It has had huge growth over the last several years, and as you talk to agency managers, there's a significant level of frustration about micromanagement from the Department of Administrative Services. I think we need to look at that. We need to figure out, does it make sense to have that middle layer of management, or can we reduce it in some ways?
Regulations.
Well, I think we have to be careful about regulating private sector business in the state, and I think there's a lot of Oregonians that find plastic bags at grocery stores to be fairly convenient, or very convenient, quite honestly, to carry their groceries home in. I also know that a lot of folks reuse those plastic bags, and so they're not just automatically a one-use kind of process. And I also know that the grocery stores have provided recycling centers for folks to bring those bags back. Having said all that, in my family, we're paper bag people, and at the grocery stores, we like to use paper bags. We like to support the natural resource industries in our state that make paper bags. And I would like to do everything I can to encourage paper bag use. I think that's important, and it would support our natural resource agencies in our state, natural resource industries in our state. And as it relates to an overall plastic bag ban, I would likely be skeptical about it, and I need to listen to the facts on both sides of the issue. But regulating private sector business is not this legislator's first choice, that's for sure. There's obviously, I think, a lot of things that need to happen in education in this state. First of all, though, I don't think that as happened in this last legislative session, that you go in and you cut education by hundreds of millions of dollars like the Democrat majorities did. All that has done so far is increase class size, and you have school districts that are cutting school days, and that's not healthy. That's not helpful to the overall education of Oregon young children and young kids. So that's number one. Let's make sure we adequately and properly fund education. In addition to that, I'm a strong supporter of virtual schools and providing choice and options for parents. I helped to pass the very first charter school bill that was passed in Oregon when I was in the House of Representatives, and I actually wrote the first charter school bill that was ever introduced in the Oregon legislature. And so I think that there's ways that we need to provide more options and more choices to parents, to educators, so that they're not so tied to state government regulation. And that's what the charter school movement is about. It's about providing more flexibility and freedom, not only to parents, but to educators as well. And I would suggest that has been fairly successful. At the same time, you look at the teachers union has worked overtime to try to roll back Oregon's charter school law. And that's, I think, part of our problem is that you've got the teachers union that is so much in control of what happens in education policy today in the Oregon legislature because of the Democrat majorities. Democrat majorities are beholden to the teachers union. That's just the fact. And we have to, I think we have to elect more legislators that aren't beholden to the teachers union so that we can move forward in some of these education reform policies. So I think that's, in a nutshell, some of the things that we need to do. Let's free parents, educators. Let's give them some more options, more flexibility. But let's also make sure that we properly fund and adequately fund education. The bottom line is, you look at this election, you have a choice between two different, very different philosophies. You have a philosophy that looks at the private sector as something that you need to support. You need to support innovators and entrepreneurs, folks that are out there working hard to create the jobs that we need in order to turn this economy around. And then you have a philosophy that basically says that government is the answer, that you need to grow government, you need to create another government program in order to help the private sector. At the same time, you're pulling money out of the pocket of those private sector businesses and then turning around and if you qualify, putting the money back in another pocket. That's the real choice. The choice between a philosophy that looks at the private sector and individuals and says, you are the folks that we need to support, and a philosophy that says the public employee unions are the folks that we need to support. So those are it's stark choices, and ultimately in about 3 weeks the voters in Oregon will decide, not only in a race here in Western Washington County, but many races all across the state, and obviously in the governor's office as well.